The coat was folded so carefully over Eliza Collins's arms that it looked almost like she was cradling something precious, something she could not bear to damage further. She stood on the porch of Matthew Hartwell's ranch house with her jaw set, and her dark eyes burning with the kind of determination that only comes from a woman who has rehearsed her goodbye 100 times and still does not fully believe in it. The late October sun was cutting sideways across the New Mexico territory, throwing long orange shadows over the dust, and the air smelled of pine resin and coming cold. She had told herself this would take 5 minutes. She had told herself it would be simple. Leave the coat. Say thank you. Walk away. But Matthew was standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and flour on his forearm and an expression on his face that made the whole rehearsed speech dissolve like sugar in rain. "I brought back your coat," she said, because she had to say something. Matthew looked at the coat. He looked at her. He looked at the coat again like it had personally offended him. "I can see that," he said quietly. The silence between them was not the comfortable kind. It was the kind loaded with every word that had not been spoken in the 3 weeks since the night of the early season blizzard, when she had shown up on his doorstep half frozen and terrified, fleeing something she still had not told him about, and he had wrapped that very coat around her shoulders without asking a single question. 3 weeks of him being careful around her and her being careful around herself, and both of them pretending that what was building between them was not real enough to be dangerous. "You should keep it," he said. "Matthew, the nights are still cold. I have my own coat now. Do you?" He said it like a statement, not a question, and his voice had that low, careful quality that she had come to understand meant he was trying very hard not to say the thing he actually wanted to say. She lifted her chin. "I bought one from the dry goods store in Silo Rojo 2 days ago. I'm not in need of charity anymore." Something moved across his face. Not hurt exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something she had put there with that word charity, and she knew it even as she said it. "It was never charity," he said. "I know that, and she did know it. That was the problem. If it had been charity, she could have walked away clean." The wind came up and lifted a strand of dark hair across her cheek, and she did not reach up to move it because her arms were full of his coat, and she could not afford to be any more undone than she already was. "Eliza," he said, and just her name in his mouth was enough to make her heart do something complicated and inconvenient. "Stay for supper." She had not expected that. She had expected him to take the coat and say goodbye and let her go because that was what men like him did, men who understood boundaries, men who respected a woman's right to make her own choices even when her choices were painful. She had not expected him to ask her to stay. "I have to get back to. The boarding house will still be there in 2 hours." She stared at him. He stared back. There was something in his expression now that was neither careful nor controlled. It was the raw, honest face of a man who had been patient for 3 weeks and had reached the end of his patience, not in anger but in some kind of quiet, aching sincerity that she found more terrifying than anger would have been. "Just supper," he said. "Beef stew. I made too much." She should have said no. Everything in her history with men told her to say no. Every letter she had burned and every door she had locked and every night she had spent telling herself that the dark past she carried was hers alone to carry told her to say no. She said, "All right." To understand why that one word cost her so much, you have to go back to the beginning. It was the autumn of 1883, and Eliza Collins had arrived in Silo Rojo, New Mexico territory, with a trunk, a carpet bag, a bank draft for $42.16, and a secret that she was working very hard to keep buried. She was 26 years old, which in that country and that time was considered solidly grown, and she carried herself with the upright posture of a woman who had learned early that the world reads your spine before it reads your face. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, originally, though she had spent the last 2 years moving through Missouri and Colorado before landing here. And if there was a pattern to her movements, it was the pattern of a woman who was running from something without quite wanting to admit that was what she was doing. Silo Rojo was a proper small town by 1883 standards, which meant it had a church, a jail, a dry goods store, a saloon, a blacksmith, a doctor's office that also served as a dentist's office and occasionally a barbershop, a post office that operated out of the back of the general store, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Portia Grunwald who charged $2 a week for a room with meals and who had the sharp, knowing eyes of a woman who had seen enough of the world not to be surprised by any of it. The town sat at the edge of the Sangre de Cristo foothills, and the land around it was the kind of spectacular that nobody bothered to describe because they were too busy trying to survive in it. Eliza had come to Silo Rojo because she had heard from a woman in Trinidad, Colorado, that there was a schoolteacher position open, and she had a certificate from the Kansas State Normal School and 3 years of teaching experience and the grim determination of someone who needed a reason to stop moving and start building. The position was still open when she arrived. The town council, which consisted of the mayor, the general store owner, and the minister, interviewed her in the church on a Tuesday morning and hired her by Tuesday afternoon because she was clearly educated and clearly capable, and because the last teacher had left town in August under circumstances that nobody seemed willing to discuss in specific terms, but that Eliza gathered involved a gambling debt and a horse that did not belong to him. She settled into Mrs. Grunwald's boarding house, took up her teaching duties at the one-room schoolhouse on the edge of town, and began the careful process of building a life that was small enough to be safe and large enough to be bearable. She was good at this. She had done it before. She knew how to be pleasant without being intimate, how to be present without being known. Matthew Hartwell complicated that plan from the first day she saw him. She had been at the general store, which was also the post office, collecting a box of chalk and some readers that the county had sent down from Santa Fe, when he came in for tobacco and nails, and the two of them had nearly collided in the narrow space between the bolts of calico and the sacks of dried beans. He had caught her elbow to steady her and said, "Pardon me, ma'am," with such genuine automatic courtesy that she had looked up to see if it was real and found that it was. He was a few years older than her, 30 or thereabouts, with a lean, weathered face that looked like it had been honest its whole life and dark brown eyes that were direct without being aggressive. He wore a plain blue shirt and work-worn trousers and boots that needed resoling, and there was nothing about him that suggested he was trying to be anything other than what he was. Mrs. Grunwald, who happened to be standing nearby examining thread, had introduced them with the unself-conscious efficiency of a woman who considered herself the informal social secretary of the entire town. "Miss Collins, this is Matthew Hartwell. He ranches out on the old Vega property. Matthew, this is Miss Collins. She is our new school teacher." Matthew had touched the brim of his hat and said it was a pleasure to meet her and gone back to his tobacco and his nails. And that should have been the end of it, except that Eliza kept thinking about the 2 seconds when his hand had been on her elbow, the steadiness of it, the complete absence of anything complicated in the gesture, and how strange it was to be touched without a hidden motive behind it. They encountered each other in the natural course of small-town life over the following weeks. He attended the church she attended, not every Sunday but most. He sometimes stopped in at the same time she did at the store. Once he helped her carry a crate of books from the wagon to the schoolhouse, when she had ordered more readers and they were heavier than she had anticipated. And he had done it without being asked, and without making a production of it, just saw the situation and addressed it, and then tipped his hat and went on about his business. She found herself cataloging these moments the way you catalog things that you know are dangerous, and that you are gathering evidence about before you make a decision. She did not go looking for the story of him, but Silo Rojo was a small town and stories found you whether you looked or not. Mrs. Grunwald, over supper one Wednesday evening, mentioned that Matthew Hartwell had come to the territory from East Texas 6 years ago, after his family's land had been lost to debt. His father had died not long after the move, and he had built the ranch on the Vega property essentially from nothing, buying the land with money he had saved working cattle drives up from Texas, and then spending 3 years developing it with the quiet, methodical stubbornness of a man who did not know how to do anything halfway. He was well regarded in the county. He was honest in his dealings. He had courted a woman named Clara Brannigan 2 years back, but she had gone back east to marry a man with better prospects, and Matthew had apparently taken this not with bitterness, but with a kind of philosophical acceptance that Mrs. Grunwald found either admirable or worrying depending on her mood. "He is a good man," Mrs. Grunwald said, in the tone of a woman who is not particularly subtle about her opinions. "The kind of good that is not performed for an audience." Eliza had said, and looked at her plate, which was Mrs. Grunwald's correct interpretation of a signal to change the subject. The problem was that Eliza's dark past was not staying as buried as she needed it to be. His name was Gerald Voss, and he had found her. She had known it was possible. She had known it was possible from the moment she left Abilene 2 years ago, because men like Gerald Voss did not accept being left as a fact about themselves that they could absorb and move on from. Gerald Voss was a man who understood the world through the lens of what was his and what was not his, and he had decided 2 years ago, after the 18 months she had spent working in the hotel in Abilene where he had been a frequent guest, that she was his. She had not agreed with this characterization. She had, in fact, disagreed with it in terms that were clear and final. And then she had left Abilene before he could translate his disagreement into something she could not escape from. She had been careful. She had not written to anyone in Abilene. She had not used her full name anywhere except legal documents, and she had kept those to a minimum. But Gerald Voss had money and he had time, and apparently he had been patient in a way that frightened her more than impatience would have. The first sign was a letter that arrived at the post office addressed to Miss E. Collins, Silo Rojo, NM Territory. She saw it through the small window where Mr. Abernathy sorted the mail, and she recognized the handwriting on the envelope before he had fully turned it around, and the blood in her veins went cold in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She took the letter. She did not open it at the post office. She walked back to the boarding house and sat on the edge of her bed and held it for a long time before she opened it. It was not threatening in its specific language. It never was with Gerald. It was the language of a man who was certain, quietly and completely certain, that everything he wanted was simply a matter of time. He knew where she was. He would be coming to New Mexico Territory in the spring to survey some land investment he had. He looked forward to seeing her. He was certain she would understand by then that her reluctance had been a kind of game that he had been happy to indulge, but that they were both now too mature for. She burned the letter in the fireplace in her room. She went on teaching. She went on being pleasant and present without being known. She told herself that spring was 5 months away, and that she would figure out what to do before it arrived. But then October came, and with it the early season blizzard that nobody in the territory had anticipated, and Eliza found herself stranded 2 miles out of town on a road that had become impassable in the space of 40 minutes, her horse having thrown a shoe on an icy rock and gone lame, the snow driving sideways, and the temperature dropping so fast she could feel the cold getting into her lungs with every breath. She had been returning from a visit to the Henderson family, whose children she tutored separately because they lived too far from the schoolhouse to attend regular classes, and she had misjudged the weather and left too late, and now she was in genuine danger in the kind of open, indifferent way the landscape of New Mexico Territory specialized in. She could not see more than 20 feet in any direction. She could see the shapes of fence posts along the road, which told her she was still on the road, and she could see through the white chaos a faint orange light that she made herself walk toward because it was either a house or the beginning of hypothermia, and she had to choose one. It was Matthew Hartwell's ranch. She had not known that. She had not known where his property was in relation to the road she was on. She found out later, when she could think clearly, that his property was the old Vega land and his house was the one that sat 300 yards back from the south road, and that if the blizzard had hit when she was a half-mile further along, she would have had nowhere to go and the story would have ended differently. He opened the door before she knocked, which told her he had seen her coming through the window, and he looked at her for 1 second with the particular quality of alarm that a decent person has when they see someone who is in real trouble, and then he moved with a calm, quick efficiency that she would think about later. He got her inside and out of her frozen outer coat, and he wrapped his own heavy coat, the brown wool one with the deep collar, around her shoulders immediately, before anything else, before any words, and the warmth of it after the cold was so sudden and so complete that she had to press her lips together to keep herself from crying. He built up the fire. He heated water. He made her drink something hot, coffee laced with a modest measure of whiskey, while she sat in the chair closest to the fireplace and slowly stopped shaking. His dog, a big brown and white mixed breed he called Hector, lay down at her feet with the philosophical generosity of a dog who understood that company was the most important thing. The horse, she had managed to ask. In the barn. I brought her in. The shoe can be fixed. She had nodded. They sat in a silence that was surprisingly easy given that she was a woman alone in a man's house in a snowstorm, and both of them were essentially strangers to each other. He did not ask her what she was doing out on the road in such weather. He did not ask her anything that felt like an imposition. He cooked beans and cornbread on the iron stove, heated through what he had left from his own supper, and put a plate in front of her, and she ate it because she was hungry and because it was good, and at some point in the eating the fear that had been riding her since she first smelled the blizzard coming began to ease. She stayed the night because there was no other choice. He gave her the bedroom and slept on his own bedroll in front of the fire with Hector for company, and she heard him in the morning before she was fully awake, the sound of him moving around the kitchen, the sound of coffee being made, and for a disorienting few seconds before she remembered where she was, she thought she was somewhere safe and that everything was going to be fine. In the morning the storm had passed, and the sky was the brilliant cold blue that follows a blizzard in New Mexico, and he drove her back to town in the wagon with her horse tied behind, and when she climbed down at the boarding house she realized she was still wearing his coat, and she said she would return it, and he said there was no hurry. And then 3 weeks had gone by. She had told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She had told herself the coat was warm and practical, and she would return it when she had made other arrangements. But the truth that she was avoiding was simpler and more frightening. She had spent 3 weeks being careful not to go back to his ranch, because going back to his ranch meant seeing him again, and seeing him again meant acknowledging that the night of the blizzard had done something to the careful, defended architecture of her interior life that she had not yet figured out how to undo. She had learned things about herself that night. She had learned that she had been lonely for a very long time and had become so accustomed to the loneliness that she had stopped noticing it. The way you stop noticing a chronic ache until someone touches the spot, and the pain flares sharp and sudden. She had learned that there was a version of safety she had never thought to want, which was not the safety of locks and distance, but the safety of being in the presence of someone who was simply, reliably good. She had also learned that Gerald Voss's letter had frightened her more than she had admitted, and that the night in Matthew Hartwell's house was the first night in 2 years she had slept without dreaming about Abilene. So she had stayed away for 3 weeks, and then she had folded his coat and walked the 2 miles out to his ranch to return it and end the whole thing cleanly, and instead she was sitting at his kitchen table watching him ladle beef stew into 2 bowls and wondering how she had arrived here and what it was going to cost her. His kitchen was the kind of room that showed you how a person actually lived. There was a shelf with 4 books on it, which told her something. There was a coffee tin on the counter with a crack in it that had been repaired with tin solder and was still in use, which told her something else. There were dried herbs hanging from the low beam, not decoration but actual use, sage and what looked like wild oregano, and a clay pot of sourdough starter sitting on the counter. The table was plain wood, well made, with 2 chairs. There was a window that looked west over the pasture, and through it she could see the last of the afternoon light going gold on the dry grass. He set the bowls down and sat across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other with the slightly charged quality of 2 people who have been trying very hard to avoid a conversation and can feel it nevertheless bearing down on them like weather. "Thank you," she said, about the stew. "It needed more time to cook properly," he said, "but it is edible." She tasted it. It was, in fact, quite good, hearty with chunks of beef and potato, and a depth of flavor that suggested he had let the base cook long and slow, but she did not say that because she had a feeling that complimenting his cooking would somehow shift the balance of the evening in a direction she was not yet ready for. "How are the children doing?" he asked. "At the school?" "Well," she said. "The Henderson boys are coming along with their reading. The Ray's girl is exceptional. She will go further than Silo Rojo if anyone gives her the tools." He nodded, and she could see that he was genuinely interested and not just making conversation, which was another thing about him that was quietly disarming. "Were you a teacher before Kansas?" he asked. She hesitated. It was a natural question. It was an innocent question. But her history was a map with certain areas that she had blacked out, and she was always alert to questions that might lead toward them. "I studied in Kansas," she said. "I taught for 3 years in and around Abilene before I came south." "What brought you south?" he asked, and again it was a simple, genuine question, and she felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with the awareness that simple, genuine questions could get you into more trouble than complicated, suspicious ones. "I wanted somewhere different," she said. He accepted this. He did not push at it. He ate his stew and she ate her stew, and outside the window the light was finishing its long golden fade into purple, and the first stars were beginning to appear over the foothills. "Can I ask you something?" she said, because she was apparently going to say something she had not planned to say. "Yes. Why did you ask me to stay tonight?" He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she almost added something to fill the silence, and then he said, "Because you looked like you were about to say goodbye and I was not ready to hear it." She looked at him. He met her eyes without flinching. "Matthew," she said, and even she could hear the warning in her own voice, the careful, protective warning that was really directed at herself. "I know," he said. "I know you have reasons. I'm not asking you to explain them tonight. I'm just asking you to eat supper." The simplicity of it was almost more than she could manage. She looked down at her bowl and took another spoonful, and when she looked up again, he had gone back to eating too, not watching her, giving her the space of not being watched, and something in her chest that had been tight for a very long time loosened by a very small degree. After supper he made coffee, and they sat with the cups on the table between them, while outside the coyotes started their evening conversation on the hillside, and Hector raised his head to listen, and then put it back down with the philosophical resignation of a dog who has decided coyotes are not worth the effort. "I need to tell you something," she said, and she said it before she could think about it more carefully because she had learned that certain truths had to be said fast or they would not be said at all. He waited. "I left Abilene because of a man," she said. "Not because I wanted a man, because I needed to be away from one." She watched his face. It did not change in any of the ways she was braced for. It did not go suspicious or calculating or, worse, sorry for her in the way that involved a subtle condescension. It just went quiet and present. "Is he still a concern?" Matthew asked. "He knows where I am," she said. "He wrote me a letter. He plans to come to the territory in the spring." "What is his name?" "Gerald Voss. He has money and he considers me." She stopped. "He considers things to be a certain way between us that are not actually that way. Does he know that? I made it very clear when I left Abilene." "Some men," Matthew said carefully, "do not allow themselves to understand what is made clear." "Yes," she said, "exactly." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "What do you need?" he asked. Practically. She had not expected that question. She had expected some variety of reassurance or advice, or the offer of protection delivered in a manner that involved him inserting himself into a situation in a way that would complicate her autonomy. She had not expected him to simply ask what she needed. "I am not certain yet," she said honestly. "All right," he said. "When you are certain, you can tell me." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamplight was warm on his face, and there was something in his expression that she found herself wanting to trust in a way that was almost painful, because wanting to trust something was the beginning of trusting it, and trusting it was the beginning of needing it, and needing things had always, in her experience, been how you got hurt. "You are a very unusual man," she said. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Is that good or bad?" "I am undecided," she said, and she heard her own voice catch slightly on the last word and had to look away. She left when the moon was up, riding her own horse back to town on the road that was familiar now and cold and silver with moonlight. She had his coat draped over the saddle in front of her because when she had gone to put it on to leave, he had stopped her with a quiet, "Eliza," and she had turned, and he had handed her her own coat from the hook by the door with the simple statement, "You should wear the one that fits you," and the subtext of that he had noticed which coat fit her, and which one she was carrying, had done something warm and terrifying in the region of her sternum. She told herself on the ride home that nothing had changed. She had returned the coat. She had eaten supper. She had told him more than she had meant to tell him. That was the situation, but things had changed and she knew it. The next few weeks moved with the particular quality of a story gathering speed. She saw Matthew in town twice more before he came by the schoolhouse on a Thursday afternoon, arriving just as she was releasing the children for the day, and helping her carry several of the heavier benches that she had been trying to rearrange to better accommodate the different age groups in her one-room school. He stayed afterward and they talked about the school, and about a book she had on the shelf that turned out to be one he had also read, a collection of natural history essays by a man named John Muir, and the conversation went on longer than either of them planned, and when he finally left, she stood in the doorway of the schoolhouse watching his horse disappear down the road, and felt the particular quality of ache that comes from something ending that you did not want to end. He began stopping by on Fridays. This was not an announced arrangement. It simply became the pattern, the way things in the territory often became patterns, through repetition rather than declaration. He would come by at the end of the school day, and sometimes he brought things: a haul of late-season apples from his small orchard, a piece of venison from a deer he had taken, once a jar of wild honey from a colony he had found in a hollow tree, and these were brought with the particular careful offhandedness of a man who was paying attention to someone, but does not want to be accused of it in case it is unwelcome. She accepted these things. She told herself it was because refusing them would be rude and complicated, and she was trying not to make things complicated. She told herself this with decreasing conviction over the course of November. She also, in this period, began doing her own research about Gerald Voss, writing carefully worded letters to a woman she trusted in Abilene, a former colleague named Helen Park who had been another teacher at the school there, and who was not easily frightened and who knew how to be discreet. The reply, when it came, was not reassuring. Gerald Voss had in the past year apparently consolidated a significant amount of property in Kansas, and was indeed moving investment interests into New Mexico territory. Helen did not know more than this, but she had heard his name mentioned in connection with a business partner who had some history of using, Helen wrote with characteristic directness, methods that are not strictly legal when a situation requires it. Eliza read this letter on a Sunday morning in her room at the boarding house and felt the cold, familiar weight of understanding that the situation was more serious than she had allowed herself to fully accept. A man with money and determination, and a business partner of uncertain ethics, was not a problem she could manage by being careful and hoping spring would change things. She went to see the county sheriff, a man named Sheriff Dale Putnam, who was competent and not unkind, but who was also very clear with her that a letter, even an unwelcome one, was not in itself a legal matter, and that until Gerald Voss actually came to the territory and actually caused a problem, there was not much the law could do. He told her to keep the letter, just in case, and suggested she speak to the county attorney if she had further concerns. She left the sheriff's office feeling the specific frustration of being told that the problem is not quite a problem yet. Matthew was sitting on the bench outside the general store when she came out. He was not there to see her specifically. He had come into town for supplies, but he saw her face and stood immediately. "What happened?" he asked. She told him. All of it this time. Not the careful abbreviated version from the kitchen table that night, but the whole thing, standing on the board sidewalk in the November wind with her hands in her coat pockets and her voice steady, because she had decided that being afraid and being steady were not mutually exclusive. She told him about Abilene and Gerald and the 18 months that had felt like the slow tightening of a trap, the gradual escalation from unwanted attention to something that felt like a cage being built around her, one bar at a time. She told him about leaving, about the 2 years of moving. She told him about the letter. Matthew listened. He did not interrupt. He did not put his arm around her or take her hand or any of the instinctive physical gestures of comfort that would have felt like an imposition. He just listened with his complete and undivided attention. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He will not get near you. Matthew, you cannot." "Not by force," he said, and she heard the deliberate quality of that clarification, the acknowledgement that he understood she did not need a man to solve this with violence. "I mean that this town will not let a man like that operate here without answering for it. You have people here, Eliza. Mrs. Grunwald, the minister, the families whose children you teach. You are not alone in this." She had not thought of it in those terms. She had been alone with it for so long that the idea of the problem belonging to a community rather than only to herself was a reconfiguration that required a moment to absorb. "Why do you care?" she asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge, and he heard it as such. He looked at her for a moment. "I think you know why," he said. And then he picked up his supplies from the bench beside him and walked down to his horse, and she stood there in the wind watching him and feeling something shift in her with a slow, tectonic certainty that she could no longer pretend was not happening. December came to the New Mexico territory with a particular ferocity. The mountains behind Silo Rojo went white to their bases, and the road to Matthew's ranch was sometimes impassable for days at a time. But somehow they found each other, in church, in town, at the school. Letters began to pass between them, which was the more proper format for communication in the territory when physical meeting was impractical, and Eliza found that writing to him came more easily than she had expected. He wrote back in a clear, careful hand that matched his speech, direct and honest and without performance, and she read his letters at her desk after the children had gone home, and she was alone in the schoolhouse with the fire and the winter light and the quiet. He told her in a letter in December that he had built the ranch house himself, with help from a neighbor in the first year, and that there were things about it he would do differently now. He told her about his father and about East Texas, and about the drives up through Oklahoma territory that had been hard and long, and had taught him things about endurance that he was grateful for even though he had not enjoyed them at the time. He told her that he had not thought, when he left Texas, that he would find anywhere that felt like the right place, and that the Sangre de Cristo foothills had surprised him. She told him, in turn, about her family in Illinois, her parents who were small farmers and gentle people, and about the schooling she had pursued against modest opposition from a world that considered it more effort than a woman needed, and about the first years of teaching and the particular kind of satisfaction in it that was like nothing else she had experienced. She did not tell him everything, not yet, but she told him more than she had told anyone in 2 years, and the act of telling felt like slowly opening a window in a room that had been sealed too long. Gerald Voss arrived in Silo Rojo on a Tuesday in early February. She had known something was wrong before she knew what it was. There was a quality to her morning that had the particular taut, uneasy texture of a day that is about to change, and she had gotten through the school day with the low-grade awareness of something approaching. When she dismissed the children at 4 o'clock and turned to bank the fire in the stove, Mrs. Grunwald was in the doorway. "There is a man at the boarding house," Mrs. Grunwald said. "He came this afternoon. He gave his name as Voss and asked for you." Eliza set down the poker very carefully and turned around. "He is well dressed," Mrs. Grunwald said, "and polite in the way of men who use politeness as a kind of weapon." Eliza looked at this woman who had sharp, knowing eyes and who had always seen more than she let on, and felt a rush of gratitude that was very close to the thing she felt when she thought about Matthew. "Did you tell him where I was?" "I told him you were engaged until 6 o'clock and that he should wait in the parlor," Mrs. Grunwald said. "And then I came here." She paused. "I also sent young Tommy Abernathy out to the Hartwell ranch, just to let him know you had a visitor." Eliza closed her eyes for 1 second. "Thank you," she said. "Do not thank me yet," Mrs. Grunwald said. "Come." She walked back to the boarding house beside Mrs. Grunwald with her spine straight and her heart rate elevated and the old, cold, familiar weight of Gerald Voss settling over the afternoon like a change in weather. She had time, on the walk, to remind herself that she was not the same woman she had been in Abilene. She had papers. She had a contract with the school board. She had a community that knew her. She was not trapped. Gerald Voss was standing by the parlor window when she came in, and he turned with the smile of a man who has been confident for a very long time that his confidence is justified. He was in his late 30s, well dressed as Mrs. Grunwald had said, with the particular groomed quality of someone who considers appearance a tool. He looked at her with the proprietary ease of someone looking at something he considers his. "Eliza," he said, "you look well." "Mr. Voss," she said, and she kept her voice entirely level. He glanced at Mrs. Grunwald, who had not left. "I would like to speak with Miss Collins privately," he said. "This is my parlor," Mrs. Grunwald said, and sat down in her chair by the fireplace with the serene immovability of a woman who has chosen her ground. Gerald's smile thinned marginally. He turned back to Eliza. "I have come a long way," he said, "to have a conversation that I think we both knew was coming." "There is nothing for us to discuss," Eliza said. "I disagree. I have land interests in this territory now. I intend to be here regularly." He let that sit in the air. "I think you understand what that means." "It means you have business in New Mexico territory," she said. "It means nothing else." "Eliza, Miss Collins," she said. His eyes went slightly harder. She had not seen that look in 2 years, but she recognized it perfectly. The look of a man who is recalibrating from charm to pressure, because charm has not produced the result he expected. The front door opened and Matthew came in. She had not heard his horse. He must have ridden hard. He was in his work coat with dust still on him, and he came into the parlor and stopped, reading the room in the single competent second of a man who knows what tension looks like. "Matthew," Mrs. Grunwald said warmly. Gerald Voss looked at him. Matthew looked at Gerald Voss with a quality of assessment that was calm and complete and entirely without aggression, the look of a man who is deciding what he is dealing with. "This is Matthew Hartwell," Eliza said, and she heard the steadiness of her own voice as if from a slight distance. "Mr. Voss," Matthew said, and his tone was perfectly civil and completely devoid of anything that could be called a welcome. "Mr. Hartwell," Gerald said, "and your connection to Miss Collins." Matthew looked at him for one beat of silence that Eliza felt in her pulse. "She is mine," Matthew said quietly, and then in the same tone, without drama, "and I mean by that she has people here. I am one of them. This town is full of them." Gerald's expression shifted through several things that he was trying to keep controlled. He looked at Eliza. "Is that true?" he said, and beneath the controlled surface of his voice, there was something that might have been the first genuine surprise she had ever heard from him. She looked at Matthew, who who was looking at her with an expression of complete steady patience, putting no pressure on her, offering but not insisting. "Yes," she said. "That is true." Gerald Voss left the boarding house that afternoon. He was in town for 2 more days, and she knew that Matthew, and she suspected several other men in town, were quietly, calmly visible during that time in a way that communicated without any specific threat that Silo Rojo was a community, and that Eliza Collins belonged to it. She heard later from Sheriff Putnam that Gerald had stopped in to ask some questions, and that the sheriff had also had a very clear conversation with him about the laws of the territory and the difference between business interests and personal harassment. Gerald Voss left Silo Rojo on Thursday morning, and she did not, in the years that followed, hear from him again. But on the Tuesday evening, after he had gone back to whatever room in the hotel he had taken, she went to find Matthew, who was at the livery stable seeing to his horse. She walked in and he turned, and they looked at each other in the quiet smell of hay and horses and winter cold. "Thank you," she said. "I meant what I said," he said. "I know you did, that is why I am thanking you." He reached up to hang his saddle on the peg, and she watched his hands, the way he moved, the economy of it, no wasted motion, everything done right the first time. "I should not have let it go so long," she said. "Being alone with it, I think I had convinced myself that being alone was the same as being strong." "They can feel like the same thing," he said. "They are not." "No," she said. "They are not." She crossed the distance between them, and when she took his hand he looked down at it, and then up at her with an expression that she would spend the rest of her life trying to describe accurately and never quite managing. Something like gravity, something like relief, something like the particular quality of joy that is so large it comes out quiet. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said. He brought her hand up and pressed his lips to her knuckles, formal and gentle, and the warmth of it went all the way through her. February turned to March, and March was when everything that had been accumulating between them finally stopped moving sideways and moved forward. He took her riding on a Saturday, up into the foothills where the spring was beginning to assert itself in the form of small flowers coming up in the shelter of the south-facing rocks, yellow and white, improbably delicate in the austere landscape. They rode to a point where the land fell away and you could see the whole of the valley below, Silo Rojo tucked into the curve of the river, the irrigated fields beginning to green, the road running out toward the mountains in the east. He said, "I want to tell you something." "Tell me," she said. "I have been thinking about what I want, since you came to the territory, since the night of the blizzard." He was looking at the valley. "I am 31 years old, and I have spent 6 years building something on this land, and I have always known, in some undefinable way, that I was building it for more than just myself. But I had started to think that the more than myself part was not going to happen." She said nothing because she could hear that he was not finished. "I am not a complicated man," he said, and she almost smiled because that was exactly the thing a complicated man would think about himself if he had no vanity in the matter. "I know what I want. I want you to stay." He turned to look at her then. "Not just in Silo Rojo. I want you to stay." The horses stood patient in the wind, and below them the valley was green and gold in the March light, and she looked at this man who had wrapped his coat around her in a blizzard without asking a single question, and who had listened to her when she was frightened, and who had understood without being told that what she needed was someone who asked what she needed rather than assuming they knew. "I have never been very good at staying," she said. "I know," he said. "I am not asking you to be good at it. I am asking you to try." She felt the thing in her chest that she had been guarding against for months, the thing that was warm and terrifying and that she had called dangerous, because calling it dangerous was easier than calling it what it actually was, which was love. She felt it arrive completely and finally, like a river finding its level after a long, uncertain course. "I will try," she said. He reached over from his horse and took her hand, and they sat for a while on the hillside above Silo Rojo with the spring coming in around them, and the horses dozed in the sun, and she thought that this was what it felt like to be somewhere that was the right place at last. They were married in June. The wedding was held in the church in Silo Rojo on a Saturday that the whole town, essentially, attended. Mrs. Grunwald wept openly and made no apology for it. The minister, who had known both of them through the preceding months and was entirely unsurprised, married them with genuine warmth in a service that was short because neither of them needed elaboration. The thing was true and simple, and did not require a long speech to establish it. Eliza wore a blue dress, not white, blue the color of the morning sky over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, because she was a practical woman and white was impractical, and also because the blue made Matthew look at her in the church doorway before the ceremony started with an expression that made Mrs. Grunwald, watching, press her handkerchief to her mouth. They drove out to the ranch after the celebration in the church hall, where there had been food and music and dancing, and where Eliza had danced with Matthew to a waltz played on a fiddle by a man named Segundo Cruz, who turned out to be unexpectedly accomplished. And the drive home was quiet and comfortable in the specific way of two people who have established a profound ease with each other. She stood in the doorway of the ranch house that was now hers as well as his, and looked around it with new eyes. The kitchen with its shelf of books and its cracked coffee tin, the window looking west over the pasture, the bedroom that he had given her during the blizzard and that was now theirs. "It needs some things," he said, coming to stand beside her. "It is perfect as it is," she said. "The window in the back room leaks when it rains, Matthew, and the shelf in the kitchen is too high for you, Matthew," she said again, and she was smiling now and he was smiling back at her, and the low angle of the June evening light was coming through the west window and making the ordinary room into something luminous. "I will fix them," he said. "You will fix them in good time," she said. "Not tonight." He reached up and tucked the strand of dark hair back from her face that the wind had lifted, the same strand that had blown loose on the day she came to return the coat, and his hand stayed against her cheek for a moment and she leaned into it. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For asking me to stay for supper." He laughed, a real laugh, low and warm, and she thought she would remember the sound of it for the rest of her life, which she did. They settled into the life of the ranch with the unhurried steadiness of two people who know what they are doing and what it is for. Eliza continued teaching. The school board, initially uncertain about whether a married woman would remain in the position, was quickly brought around by Eliza's clear communication that her marriage had not reduced her interest in education, and by the community's equally clear communication that Miss Collins, now Mrs. Hartwell, was the best teacher the town had had in 15 years, and they would be foolish to lose her. The school board reconsidered. Matthew's ranch began to grow in ways that had been waiting for a moment of stability to unfold. He added cattle in the second year, purchasing a small herd from a rancher who was moving his operation north, and the land proved as good for the purpose as he had always believed it could be. He hired a hand named Rufus Delgado, who was a quiet, skilled horseman from a family that had been in the territory for 3 generations, and Rufus and his wife occasionally came for supper on Sundays in a way that became a quiet and comfortable ritual. Eliza planted a garden. This was, in retrospect, the most quietly significant thing she did in the first year of the marriage, not because of the garden itself, but because of what it meant to her. She had not planted a garden in 2 years of moving. Planting things required staying, required belief that you would be there to see them grow. She put in a kitchen garden on the south side of the house, beans and squash and peppers and herbs, and when the first things came up in May, she stood in the garden in the morning light and felt the deep, specific satisfaction of someone who has chosen something and been rewarded for the choice. In the autumn of 1884, which was exactly 1 year after Eliza had arrived in Silo Rojo, and the same season she had come to return the coat, she told Matthew one evening over supper that she thought they were going to have a child. He was still for a moment in the way that he went still when something mattered very much. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. "Are you well?" he asked first, and she loved him for that what he asked first was not about his own feeling but about her condition. "I am very well," she said. a little tired sometimes in the mornings, but well. He brought her hand up in that gesture she knew, his lips to her knuckles, and she could feel the slight tremor in his hands that he was not controlling, the overflow of feeling. "Good," he said. His voice was rough. "Matthew," she said fondly. "I am fine," he said, and he was clearly not entirely fine in the sense that he was so profoundly moved that fine was inadequate as a description. But she understood what he meant, which was that he was more than fine, that this was beyond fine and into something for which he did not currently have sufficient vocabulary. The baby was born in the summer of 1885, in June, which felt right to Eliza, summer being the season she associated with the beginning of everything good. He was a boy, solid and loud, and with his father's dark brown eyes and a quantity of dark hair that made Dr. Caldwell, who delivered him, remark that he was the best hair-endowed infant he had seen in a year of practice. They named him James after Matthew's father, and the name suited him, which was something you noticed from the first days of a person's life. Matthew was, as a father, exactly what Eliza had known he would be without having specifically thought about it. Present and steady, and genuinely interested in the person, his son was from the very beginning, the kind of father who talks to his infant not in a performative way, but because he is actually curious about what is going on in that small working mind. She watched them together, Matthew with James on his chest in the evenings, the big man and the small boy both content in the particular way of people who have found exactly where they belong, and felt something that was beyond happiness, that was more in the register of deep, abiding rightness. James learned to walk in the spring of 1886 and promptly tried to follow his father everywhere, which Matthew accommodated with patient good humor, bringing the boy along on the shorter circuits of the ranch and naming things for him: horse, fence, water, sky, the way you show a person the world they have arrived in. Eliza watched all of this and continued teaching and continued tending her garden and continued being, in the life of Silo Rojo, the teacher who saw the potential in children that others missed. She got the school a second room added in 1886 by writing a letter to the County Board of Education that was, as she told Matthew when she reported the result, not exactly polite but apparently effective. He had smiled at that in the way she loved, the smile that understood her completely. The winter of 1886 was a hard one across the New Mexico territory, the kind of winter that tested everything. The cattle were difficult to manage in the deep cold, and Matthew and Rufus spent long days in conditions that were grueling, and Eliza understood this as part of the life they had built, and she kept the house warm and the food ready and the lamps lit in the windows on the long evenings. And when he came in cold and tired, she had learned the specific way he needed to be brought back to warmth, which was not talking about it but sitting with him by the fire while James slept. Her hand on his and the coyotes on the hillside and the house around them solid against the dark. They lost 8 head of cattle that winter. Matthew told her about it with the particular steadiness of a man who has accepted the loss already and is reporting a fact, and she nodded and said they would manage, and he looked at her with a warmth that told her he had not entirely expected to be believed, that he had expected some version of worry or complaint, and that her simple confidence in their capacity to manage was its own kind of gift. Mrs. Grunwald came for supper often in 1887. She was getting older, though she would not have thanked anyone for observing it, and the boarding house was running with slightly less of the iron precision of its early years. She and Eliza had developed the kind of friendship that was forged in the circumstances of the boarding house winter and Gerald Voss's visit, and the wedding and all the things that had followed. A friendship between two women who saw each other clearly, and considered that a gift rather than a vulnerability. "You were the most self-sufficient, unhappy person I had ever met," Mrs. Grunwald told Eliza once, on a Sunday afternoon when they were sitting on the porch while James napped and Matthew was out working and the world was warm and golden. "Was I unhappy?" Eliza said. "You were careful," Mrs. Grunwald said. which is a kind of unhappiness. Eliza considered this. Yes, she said. I think that is true. You are not careful anymore, Mrs. Grunwald said, with the simple satisfaction of someone reporting a correct outcome. No, Eliza said, I am not. In the summer of 1887, Eliza discovered she was expecting again. She told Matthew in the kitchen after supper, James already in bed, the house quiet around them. He looked at her across the table with the same quality of stillness that had preceded the first time, the profound, careful attention of a man receiving news that matters enormously. Again, we are well, he said, and she smiled at the we, the way he had begun to include himself in the condition of her pregnancies as a matter of natural fact. Again we are well, she said. This time it was a girl, born in the early spring of 1888 into a world that was beginning to thaw, a small, fierce person with her mother's dark eyes and a temperament that announced itself clearly in the first hours. They named her Ruth, for a reason that was both biblical, and because Eliza had always thought it was a strong, clean name, and Ruth proved to be exactly that, strong and clean and entirely certain of her own character from a very early age. James, at nearly 3, received his sister with the scientific interest of a small person encountering a new phenomenon, and Matthew watched his children being introduced to each other with an expression on his face that Eliza, seeing it, had to look away from for a moment because it was too openly, vulnerably beautiful. The years settled into a rhythm that was deeply satisfying in its variety, which might seem contradictory, but was the true nature of a full life. The ranch grew. The school expanded. The children grew into people, James serious and curious like his father, Ruth fierce and articulate like her mother, and also like her father in the ways that nobody expected, the quiet humor, the capacity for patience when patience was required. They got a second dog when Hector died at an old age of 11, a solemn event that James marked with a ceremony of his own devising, and that Matthew bore with a quietness that told Eliza that Hector had meant more to him than he was likely to say aloud. The new dog was a cattle dog, brown and alert, whom Ruth named Jasper when she was 3 with the decisive authority of a person who has considered the matter and made her determination. In 1890, when James was 5 and Ruth was 2, the railroad extended a spur line that came within 12 miles of Silo Rojo, and the town changed the way all small towns in the territory changed when the railroad got near them, faster, more connected, more complicated. New people arrived. New businesses opened. The school needed a third teacher by 1891, and Eliza helped train the 2 young women who came to assist her with the authority and generosity of a woman who understood that knowledge is not diminished by sharing. Matthew, who had always been the kind of man who valued quality over expansion for its own sake, grew his operation carefully rather than aggressively, and by 1892, the Hartwell Ranch was a property of modest but solid standing in the county, known for good cattle and good management, and a reliability that was worth more in the long term than the flashier operations that expanded too fast and sometimes collapsed. On an October evening in 1893, exactly 10 years after Eliza Collins had arrived in Silo Rojo with her trunk and her carpet bag, and her secret that she had been working hard to keep buried, she was sitting on the porch of the ranch house, watching the evening come over the foothills when Matthew came and sat beside her in the second chair, the one that had been there since the first year, because one chair had always felt to him like an incomplete arrangement. James was doing his lessons at the kitchen table. Ruth was already in bed with some small injustice about bedtime that she had protested at length, and then succumbed to with the abrupt efficiency of a very tired child. The air smelled of pine resin and coming cold, the same smell as every October in this place, and the foothills were turning the colors they turned in autumn, gold and red and the deep rust of the Gamble oaks. 10 years, she said. Since you came, he said. Since I came, she looked at the mountains. I did not know what I was coming to. No, he said. Neither did I. She turned to look at him. The 10 years had changed him and not changed him, the way time works on people who are living well. There were more lines around his eyes and a thread of gray at his temple, and he was, she thought, if anything more himself than he had been, the way that time sometimes distills a person rather than diminishing them. "Are you glad?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was so completely, straightforwardly answered that she almost laughed. "Eliza," he said. "I know," she said. "I know." "Are you?" he asked. She thought about the woman who had stood on this porch 10 years ago, holding his folded coat and rehearsing her goodbye. She thought about the cold, careful, lonely architecture of that woman's life, the blacked-out maps, the burned letters, the relentless forward motion that was really a kind of standing still. She thought about the night of the blizzard and his coat around her shoulders and the warmth arriving like an answer to a question she had been afraid to ask. She thought about supper in this kitchen and the coffee cups on the table and the coyotes on the hillside. She thought about James and Ruth and Mrs. Grunwald and Hector and Jasper and Rufus Delgado playing guitar on Sunday evenings, and the garden on the south side of the house and the school and the railroad, and all the 10 years of a life that had been built, carefully and well, in a place that turned out to be the right place after all. "I am," she said, "completely." He reached over and took her hand in the way that he had always taken her hand, simply and without ceremony, and they sat on the porch as the evening came down over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the stars came out one by one over the territory, and inside the house James's pen scratched on paper, and from somewhere on the hillside a coyote called and got no answer and called again, and the lights in the valley of Silo Road glowed warm and steady against the dark. She had come to return a borrowed coat. He had asked her to stay for supper, and in the particular, unhurried, stubborn way that the best things happen, from a small invitation on an October porch to 10 years of a life built together in the shadow of the mountains. They had found each other in a land that was hard and honest and exactly as beautiful as it needed to be, and they had made something that neither of them could have made alone, something that was, in its own quiet and enduring way, the most important thing either of them had ever done. Matthew Hartwell, who was 31 years old when he opened his door to a half-frozen woman in a blizzard and gave her his coat without asking a single question, understood something that not everyone comes to understand, which is that the moments that change everything are rarely the large dramatic ones but the small, true ones. A hand steadied in a narrow aisle, a plate of beans and cornbread, a coat placed around cold shoulders, a question asked with the risk of refusal. "Will you stay?" Eliza Collins, who had been running for 2 years and guarding herself for longer than that, and who had arrived in Silo Rojo with a practiced system for being present without being known, understood something different, that the self-sufficiency she had confused with strength was a kind of armor, and that armor, however necessary in the right circumstances, is not the same as protection. Protection, real protection, is what you have when you are known and wanted and have chosen to be known and wanted in return. It is what you have when the lights are on in the windows of a house that is also yours. The October night came down full and cold and brilliant over the New Mexico territory, over the foothills and the valley and the road running east to the mountains, and the two of them sat in the chairs on the porch of the ranch they had built together, hand in hand, in the particular and irreplaceable piece of people who have come through their separate difficulties and found each other on the other side, and who know, with a certainty that has been tested and holds, that they are exactly where they are supposed to be. From inside the house, James's voice called out, asking a question about his arithmetic, and Matthew called back the answer without getting up, and Eliza smiled without knowing she was smiling, and the stars were very bright over the Sangre de Cristo, and the night was cold and fine, and the story of them was nowhere near over, only beginning, only deepening, only becoming more itself with every year that passed, and every season that turned, and every morning they woke up in the same bed in the house that sat 300 yards back from the south road, where the light in the window had been lit one October night in a blizzard and had never been put out since.